Well, we begin a new sermon series today on living generously, and it's interesting that this wasn't what I had planned originally a long time ago to have in this spot of the year, but through a number of things that came up and just thinking about things, it seemed to me a good time to put this in here. And we're talking about living generously because really, coming off of our sermon series on idols, and you'll see how this kind of fits in our first point of this sermon, but coming off of our sermon on idols and going to some of the places we want to go to, this seemed a good stepping stone for that, because it really is such a fundamental aspect of our life and our character in Christ Jesus that it seems good to take some time to talk about it. So we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 11 today, verse 23 through 25. And Proverbs is an interesting book because it's really about wisdom. And one of the things that's funny is that there's a lot of times in our culture that wisdom can be associated with not being generous. Don't put too much out there. Don't give up things you might need. All that kind of stuff can be associated with wisdom. But yet Proverbs actually has a lot to say about living in a generous way. And so if you'll turn with me to Proverbs chapter 11, verse 23, we're going to talk today about the beginning of this, which is a spirit of generosity. How do you develop just an overall attitude of generosity before we get into the nuts and bolts of generosity in different aspects of our life? So in Proverbs 11:23, it says, "The desire of the righteous ends only in good, the expectation of the wicked in wrath. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered." So this is really about this attitude or spirit of generosity, and it's interesting that generosity does the opposite of what we would think it would do. It starts off in verse 23 here, saying the desire of the righteous ends only in good, but the expectation of the wicked in wrath. So the idea here is that the righteous person has an overall attitude where he wants things to end up in good. He wants things to be good. He looks out at the world and he wants good for the world. That's what the righteous person wants. And because he has this spirit of wanting good for the world, well, then he's moved in that spirit to be generous with the world. Now, the expectation of the wicked ends in wrath. The wicked doesn't really have that same outlook of wanting just good for the world. In fact, a lot of times the wicked don't want good for the world at all. And so what ends up happening is one gives freely because he wants good for the world, so he gives freely to make the world good, and then he ends up even richer from that. Another withholds, saying, well, I'm not so interested in good for the world, but I want good for myself, so I'm going to withhold that. And he suffers only want. And so the idea here is that if you want to bring blessing to people, you're going to be enriched. And if you go out watering, you're going to yourself be watered. If you're going to go out there and spread blessing around, well, then you're going to end up being blessed through that. Now, in order to have this spirit of generosity, there's a few things that need to be in place, and that's what we want to talk about today. So we'll be talking about, first of all, a repudiation of idols, because a repudiation of idols is fundamental. It's foundational for being able to have a generous spirit. Secondly, we're going to talk about a celebration of inequality, because as weird as it sounds in our culture, if you don't celebrate inequality, you can say goodbye to a spirit of generosity. And thirdly, we want to talk about the efficiency of generosity. We really have to have a faith in the efficiency of generosity. So let's look at these one by one. We'll talk about, first of all, here, the repudiation of idols. So we just spent a lot of time over the last sermon series talking about the idols in our lives. And one of the things that's interesting is to see how this plays into just what it means to be a generous person. Now, one of the things that got me thinking about this in this overall sermon series was I started thinking about back when I was a kid. So when I was a kid, we had this little church in a little town in Colorado, And we had a little parsonage that was next to the church. It was painted the same color as the church, and so you knew right away that it was the parsonage. And I went to school every day, and I had friends. And when my friends found out that my dad was the pastor of the church, there was always a lot of questions because most of my friends did not go to church. And so the first question that I always got was, "So your dad owns the church?" And I found it amusing to hear that. But the answer is no, he doesn't own the church. And then it went from there. But one of the things that was always on my mind was, how do I help my friends want to come to church? And one of the things that I, just in thinking about this recently, I started to see that, it was an uphill battle to get my friends to want to come to church. And I started thinking about, well, why was it such an uphill battle? And I started thinking about, well, what did we offer as a church? What was on tap? What was it that we were selling? And I started realizing that really one of the things, and maybe the only thing that my church of my childhood was really what it had to offer was, hey, come follow rules with us. And surprisingly enough, this is probably going to shock you, that's a hard sell for kids. Come follow rules with us. Because really, as a congregation, that's what we were about. We were about following the rules. And we were about trying to follow the rules as good as we could. And what we had to sell for people was, come follow the rules with us. And maybe a second line of this in smaller print was, you could be as miserable as we are. And that's unfortunate because it took me a really long time in life, and this is kind of the sad thing, it took me a really long time going to Bible college and even getting out of Bible college in my first ministry. It took me a really long time to figure out that that's actually not what Christianity is supposed to be about. It was a kind of a shock to me. Go, wait a second, there's more to it than this? Come follow the rules, and also under our breath you can be as miserable as us? There's more to it than this? And the thing that's interesting about this is that we really missed out growing up. And the funny thing is I was the PK, the preacher's kid. And maybe I got a wrong impression, but, I was there a lot. If the church doors were open, I was there. And, I heard a lot of talk going on in my house and all that kind of stuff. And somehow the preacher's kid missed the message. Then, probably others missed it as well. And one of the things that's important for us to understand is there's a great need for us to live lives of generosity. And really this proverb is getting into it. But there's something bigger than following the rules. If that's what our faith becomes, following the rules, then we've really missed out, because it's not really following the rules. It's resembling a father that loves us. Because really that's one of the reasons that we take on family traits, isn't it? Because you start, hopefully if things are going well in your family loves you. And so you see the traits of those family members who love you, and you see them as good because they're providing a blessing for you. And then you say, well, I want to take on that trait. And when you form your own family, you say, I want my family to have the blessings that I had. And so there's a natural tendency for that. And hopefully you don't say this as an adult. If you say, well, I need to follow the same rules that my father followed and my grandfather followed, then maybe we're not looking at this the right way. Like if you grow up and you become an adult and you say, well, this is the way I have to do because this is the rule and my father followed this rule. Maybe the way to look at it is to say, I want to resemble a loving father because of the great blessing that his love was for me. And it's not about following the rule, it's about resembling a loving father who had a great impact and a huge blessing on my life, and then I want to turn around and I want to bless other people with that. And that's not a rule. That's not rule following, that's a spirit of generosity. There's a unity in generosity, and that unity of generosity is is I value myself, and so therefore I value the blessing that I received. And because I value you like I value myself, I want you to experience that blessing as well. In John chapter 13, verse 35, there's something interesting, and it's something that would have been surprising to me maybe in my youth. It says, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples." Jesus is saying, here's the way that people are going to know. If anybody wants to know you're my disciple, they're going to know. People are going to know. You're not going to need to wear a name tag. You're not going to need to wear, a funny hat or something like that so that they know. People are going to know you're my disciples. And one of the things that would have surprised maybe my congregation of my youth is that it's not, you're going to know my disciples if you follow my rules. Everybody's going to know you're a disciple of Jesus because you follow the Jesus rules. That's not what it says. It says, by this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Love for one another. That's what it is. It's not if you follow the right rules, if you say, I'm doing the rules better than anybody else. It's if you have love for one another. If you value others the way that you value yourself and you say, I received such a great blessing from my Father, I want to pass that blessing on to you. So how does a repudiation of idols fit into this? Well, there's a problem of scarcity. And you might have been familiar with this. When you were a kid, did you ever think, well, why don't we just give everybody all kinds of money? Did you ever think that as a kid? Why are there financial problems? Why don't we just give everybody all the money that they want? Because we're in monopoly, right? You hand out the money at the beginning. Why don't we just hand out the money? And now we know, right? Now we know. Because everything's getting more and more expensive, right? Because that's what happens. Because one of the things that you learn as you get older is you realize that money isn't actually a thing. That what happens is we all make stuff and we trade that stuff for each other. And the reason we came up with money is because it makes something so much simpler. You don't have to do like a 5-way trade for everybody to get what they want. You just have money. Money's not really a real thing. It's just something that stands for real things. And so the reality is that you can only make so much stuff. There's a scarcity of things. And one of the things that's fascinating is we deal with that scarcity all the time in our lives. If you have a job dealing with scarcity, right? There's only so many things that you have. If you work at a store, there's only so many items that you have at the store. If you work at a Fetzer valve company, you only have so many of those Fetzer valves to send out. The thing is that each one of us every day, that's what we deal with, is we deal with scarcity. And so we have a mindset of scarcity. But the interesting thing is that God is infinite. And if you have a situation where the highest thing that you put in the world is something that's scarce, then you will not be very generous. Do you understand what I'm talking about? If the highest thing, if the highest good, if the highest, greatest thing of most worth that you can possibly imagine is something that is scarce, then you're going to guard that thing and you're not going to be generous with it. So you can think about somebody who, if, for example, puts as the highest, greatest good money. If money is your idol, if money is the thing that you think holds the greatest value out of anything, what are the odds of you being generous with your money? Well, of course it's not very high, right? Because this is the greatest thing that exists and it's scarce. That means because it's scarce, if I give you half of my money, then I don't have half of my money. I wasn't going to give you half of my money, just to let you know. But if you think like that, then you're going to have a spirit of scarcity. Now, the interesting thing is the answer to that was seen in the ancient times. The answer was seen to this problem of scarcity and the issue of generosity. Because if scarcity is what's of highest value, then you should withhold as much as you possibly can. But the reality is that that's not the highest thing. And they used to think that the job of the intellectual was actually to point people's eyes upward, because we had our minds in the dirt all day. Like most people were farmers, and so you thought, well, I need a certain amount of crop to feed my family, and then I need a certain amount of crop to be able to sell. And then between what I can feed my family and sell, I can make my needs met. And so after that, then I can be generous, maybe, but also I could not be generous, so then I can save up some for next year. And this is the way people think. They viewed in the ancient world that the job of all intellectuals was to point people's eyes upward to God. And it didn't matter what kind of an intellectual you were. If you were a priest, if you were a professor at a university, whatever your job was, if you were an intellectual, the whole point of being an intellectual was to point people's heads upward to God. And the reason for that is because God being infinite, you can give away all of what you know about God and you will still have all that you had before. In fact, you will also end up with more because you will learn something about God in the act of giving it away. And so the interesting thing about God being infinite is that the more that we share God with one another, not only do we not run low on God, but we actually find that our knowledge of God, the amount of God that we have in our lives, the amount of the Spirit of God that we have in us, is actually grows. See, we have a choice in our lives. Is we can either have at the highest thing something that's finite, and we have to hold on to it, and we have to be afraid of running out, or we can have at the top of our hierarchy, we can have something infinite in which no matter how much we give away, we only grow more and more, deeper and deeper. You never can run out of God. The more love that you have, the more that you give away, the more joy that you share. Have you experienced this? How many of you have experienced sharing your joy and then running out? Anyone? You're like, I've had enough of this. I've just given all my joy away. I might get some next week, but until then, stay away from me because I'm going to be grumpy. Right? That doesn't happen to us, does it? We don't say to ourselves, man, the more I share joy with other people, I just get so angry. Now, it's true that if you're trying to fake being joyful, now, how many, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but if you have to pretend to be joyful around people, that can make you angry. You see, everybody is a burden. Oh, I have to act joyful around this person. I have to act joyful around that person. The thing is, if you don't have the Spirit of God, and if you're not worshiping Him in the Spirit of God, if you're doing it to try to look a certain way, if you're going around trying to appear joyful, if you're going around trying to appear loving, that's the most exhausting work that you can do, and you will get grumpy doing that. But the reality is if you're actually sharing true joy with people, that doesn't lessen your joy. I don't know that anybody's ever had that experience of actually sharing true, genuine joy with somebody else and going, wow, I just ran out. No, what happens is when you share true, genuine joy with other people, then you actually get more joy. Have you experienced that? When you're joyful and other people are around you, you get more joy because then you're enjoying them being joyful. Isn't that the whole point of a party? And I don't mean like a lame party that you don't want to go to. You know, it's an obligation. It's like your boss at work invited you, or somebody like that invited you to a party. Oh, I don't want to go. But an actual, real, true party, the reason that it's fun and the reason why we do it is we can say, I'm happy about something. And when other people come and they're actually happy about that thing, then our joy increases, all of us. But that's the way it is with all the spiritual things: love, joy, peace. Even things like dignity. When you treat somebody with dignity, you don't run out of dignity. You actually feel more dignity for yourself as well. Have you guys noticed that? This is the thing that's great, is that when you have God at the top of your hierarchy, the more that you give, the more, and God is the most valuable thing. He's more valuable than anything else. And so you can develop a spirit of generosity where you share the highest, greatest good that there is, and the more of the most valuable thing that you give away to other people, the more that you will experience yourself. I guarantee you it's true. And you know that it's true because you've experienced it. But somehow we get to the point of we just go, I'm tired or this or that. And the thing is, the reason that we get tired is because we're not experiencing the true stuff ourselves. We're in a position where we think we need to put on a face of something, and it becomes false, and then it becomes a burden. God has to be our ultimate home and our ultimate pursuit. And when He's not, that's when we start really feeling ungenerous. When what we really want is not God, but something else. When we really want more free time. When we really want more, whatever it is, more TV, more comfort, more money, more anything else. And what we'll find is that the more that we put something else ahead of God, the more that we'll become ungenerous in our spirits. The purpose of dealing with the finite each day is learning to value the infinite. So the question you might ask yourself is, well, if this is true, then why do we deal with the finite every day? Why does the finite even exist? And the finite actually exists so that when we share with one another, we actually value what we share. So if you've noticed something, you go to a party and you say, we're going to all enjoy, let's say somebody's birthday. Let's say it's Ken Lung's birthday, and we're going to go all enjoy Ken Lung's birthday together, right? So yeah, Ken, congratulations, you lived another year. So we're going to go enjoy, and we go over to Ken's house, and Ken says, oh, welcome to the party, and we go in, and there's no decorations set up, and there's no food, there's no anything. In fact, there's no furniture. There's no anything at Ken's house, and we all stand, and none of us brought anything, and so we just stand around, and he says, let's enjoy my birthday together, and so we say, okay, we are, and he goes, no, let's really enjoy my birthday, and we are. You see the problem here, right? We're experiencing joy, Ken, we are. But the thing that's interesting about this is that joy is the thing that is motivating it. It's the Spirit that's motivating it, but then it's given value by the finite. And what that means is that there's an infinite amount of joy that might be motivating Ken, but then that infinite amount of joy is given value by the fact that he is going to, out of his finite resources, he's going to provide food for us. And he's going to say, this is my joy manifested. And it has value because it's being manifested in something finite. And we're going to come and we're going to bring food too. And we're going to all bring, I'm going to bring an ice cream cake, and you're going to bring chips, or you're going to bring something else. Whatever you want to bring, you're going to bring that too, and you're going to say, this is our joy manifested in a way. And so that's why generosity takes on physical form. Is because the limited nature of that physical form actually lends value to it. It bears witness to the value of what we're doing here, that out of all the things I could be doing with this is what I want to do. And so it's super important for us to understand that there's a repudiation of idols in our life that has to happen so that we can really have a spirit of generosity. Now, the second thing I said is that we need to have is that me? No, that's not me. Whew, that would have been awkward. A celebration of inequality, I said we need to have. Now, why do we need a celebration of inequality? Because it's actually at the heart of being able to be generous at all. So we live in a culture that's absolutely obsessed with equality. It's absolutely obsessed. And the thing that's interesting is God doesn't make anything equal. God doesn't make anything equal. In fact, it's really beyond our power to make anything equal. And it's important for us to understand this, is that inequality is built into the fabric of everything. How many times have when you were a kid, maybe you had this happen, and somebody bakes a whole bunch of cookies, right? And so they bring out the cookies, and you can try this. If you have a whole bunch of 4-year-olds or something, you can try this. And they could be store-bought cookies that look exactly the same. And you put that plate of cookies in front of the kids, and what are they going to do? They're going to look through and try to find the best one, right? And you're going to say, there is no best one. They're all the same. Now, you're looking at it as an adult. A kid, they know better. They're not all the same, right? This one has more chocolate chips in it. That's the one I'm going for. Now, sometimes as adults, we even do this too, don't we? But the thing is that you try to make things the same, you can't make them the same, and it's impossible. Let's say this. We could take, how many of you guys saw that there's a new Nissan Z coming out? You guys, now if you're a fan of the old Nissan Z, you might know this, but there's a brand new Nissan Z coming out. It's going to have 400 horsepower. Let's say this. I'll be Oprah today. You get a car, we all get Nissan Zs. Not really. Disclaimer, whatever disclaimer we need to put at the bottom of the screen, we will do that for the video. Now, the thing is that, but let's say we did. And they were exactly the same. They were the same color, had the same options, had the same everything. Are they all going to last the same amount of time? Why not? They're the same. They're equal, right? They're not. They're as equal as Nissan can make them, but that doesn't mean that they're equal. And not only that, though, here's the thing. After, let's say, 5 years of ownership, we all hold on to them for 5 years. People drive past our church and they think, that's weird. The whole parking lot's nothing but red Nissan Zs, right? And the thing is, if you have kids, we'll give your kids Nissan Zs, and they can drive them to church too. And so the thing is, we're all here, and they're all Nissan. In 5 years, are they going to look the same? No, they're not. They're not going to look the same. They're not going to be the same. They're not going to drive the same. Why? Because they had different owners. The thing is that it's impossible to make things the same. Different things will never and can never be equal because they're different things. Now, the interesting thing is that Satan, in his sin and in his pride, he wanted to be equal with God. He didn't want to be a created being. He didn't want to have a difference between him and God. He wanted to be God. In fact, that's what he promises Adam and Eve, doesn't he? He says, look, God's not withholding this tree from you because he loves you. He knows that if you take from the tree, then you will be equal with him. That's what he's promising. You can be equal with God. You can be your own God. But the reality of the situation is that can never be. In fact, what's fascinating is that if you look at the societies that really try to create equality, the totalitarian nature of the task means that those places can never, ever be free. In fact, they can only be totalitarian because they have to control every little thing. How much, if we all gave you Nissan Zs in 5 years, we wanted them all to be exactly the same, how much totalitarian control would we need to have over your lives in order to make that happen? We'd have to tell you when you can drive it, where you can store it, how many times you have to wash it, when you have to change the oil. Think about how much just to do that one thing. And because God creates freedom, the reality of the world is there's a thing. How many of you guys have heard of the Pareto principle? Pareto principle? What it means is that, and it's a principle that applies in everything that they've ever studied it. Like anytime they've said, hey, does the Pareto principle work over here? The answer is yes. What it means is that 20% will end up with 80%. 20% will end up with 80%. So, and it's true no matter what they study. Like they went to academics. And what they found was that 20% of people in academia publish 80% of the papers. What they find is that 20% of the cities in a nation will end up with 80% of the population. Like every single thing that they've ever studied, it works and it's true. It's as true as anything can be true. And why is that? Because God created a world where things aren't equal. Now, we can use that as a way to hate God or a reason to hate God. But the reality is that there's actually something behind that. There's a strategy in place. And that strategy is a really interesting strategy. And it comes down to a thing that I call poor people don't hire you. Okay? Poor people don't hire you. How many of you guys have ever been hired for a job by a poor person? If they do hire you, guess what? When payday rolls around, you aren't getting anything. Because that's the way that it works, right? Poor people don't hire you. And so the thing is when I was starting out, I remember getting a job at 16 years old. Do you guys remember your first job at 16 years old? Right? It was the greatest job you ever had, right? I remember my first night in the dish room at JB's, my very first night, it was a Friday night. They hired me on the spot. I went in and I said, hey, I'd like a job. And they said, here's your uniform, get back in the dish room. And so I started back there, and I had no idea how disgusting a dish room in a restaurant was. I won't tell you about it because you're probably going to go out to lunch after this, and I don't want to ruin it for you. But it's not a pleasant place to be. And I remember I worked like a 12-hour shift. And I went home, and I smelled absolutely wretched. And guess what I did the next day? I went back and did it again. Now, why did I go back and do it again? Because they had a restaurant. They had a dish room. They had dishes. They had food. They had all this stuff. I didn't have any of that. And so because they had more than me, I had an opportunity to go in and do a job that paid me more than what I could do out on my own with the resources that I had. Why? Because they had more. They had more, and because they had more, I could go and I could work for them. I could be blessed because they had more than me. And the thing is that this is the reality of the situation, and this is actually what makes the system work. Is that strength and weakness actually find meaning in love and generosity. Strength and weakness find meaning in love and generosity. What does that mean? How many of you guys have ever had kids or ever been a kid? Anybody here? Ever had kids or been a kid? A couple of you, okay? And the thing is that when you were a kid, were you glad that your parents were richer than you? Yes, you were. You were glad. But you were a little, come on, let's get some, you were glad. Were you glad that they were smarter than you? Were you glad that they were smarter? Yes. Were you glad that they had more money than you? Were you glad that they were smarter than you? Were you glad that they were stronger than you? Were you glad about all those things? Yes, you were glad about those things. Why? Because their strength found meaning and purpose in love. Because they were strong and you were weak, there was an opportunity for love to take place. And you know that as a parent, you're called on that all the time. Because your children are weak, that weakness is not a bad thing. It's an opportunity for your love to show forth in generosity. And generosity gives those things meaning and it draws you together. How many times have you been in a situation where you had a problem and somebody actually had to sacrifice to come and to help you in the midst of your problem, and it drew you close to them? Why? Because all of a sudden they showed love and care and concern for you, and that wouldn't have been able to happen if you were strong and independent like everybody else. If you were just a carbon copy of everyone else, and you had all the strengths that they had, and you had all the weaknesses that they had. The reason the world works the way that God designed it is God designed us to be weak and strong in different areas so that we could show love and generosity to one another. And there is a huge blessing here. How boring would it be if each one of us had all the same strengths and all the same weaknesses, and there was no reason to do anything for anybody else? How boring of a world would it be? It would not reflect the character and nature of God. Because God is love. And so God made a world where not only are we weaker than Him, and so we rely on His love, but we're weaker than one another in all kinds of different ways and stronger than one another in all kinds of different ways. And there are a million ways for us to exercise both our strength and our weakness. We have to celebrate the fact that things aren't equal. In Ecclesiastes 4:10, it's talking about two people who are working together, and it says that if they fall, one will lift his fellow. Now, here's the thing. What if this happened? You're working with somebody and they fall down, and they say, hey, I'll help you up, and you go, it's not fair. And they go, what do you mean? It's not fair? Why? Because you're standing up. I could help me up if I was standing up too. But you're standing up. It's not fair. You need to fall down on the ground too so that it can be equal between us. And so he falls on the ground, and now you're both on the ground. Well, now that's better, isn't it? Right? That's not the way that it works, is it? The reality is that the fact that he can help you because he's standing. So praise God that he's standing. Praise God that there are all kinds of inequalities in our life. And the thing is, celebrating inequality is super important. I was listening to a podcast this week, and there was an older actor that was talking to a younger actor, and they'd both been on the same show together. And it was evident that the younger actor, who was now almost my age, he was talking to the older actor, and they had been on the show together like 20 years prior, and it was evident that he held this older actor in high esteem. And he said, man, it's so great to talk to you. I'm just so excited to talk to you. It's so great to talk to you. I remember you showed me so many things. And then he went on to talk about how he stood up for him to the studio executives. And he said, these working conditions aren't safe. You need to watch out. You need to help this guy. And he did things behind the scene. And all of the things that happened. And one of the things that was fascinating about this conversation is the younger actor, still at 45 years old, was just going on and on about how much he just appreciated and remembered the older actor. And the older actor said something funny. He goes, you know what? Well, here's the thing. You took advantage of it. You listened. You were humble. And not very many people do that. The thing is, as a younger actor, he could have gone into the show with a chip on his shoulder and been like, well, I'm as good as you. I know everything that you know. And that's what a lot of times people do. And the thing is, we thwart generosity when we don't celebrate the fact that we're weak and some are strong. We thwart generosity when we do that. Being humble makes you able to be blessed by others' generosity, and being humble makes you generous with your own strength, because you realize that the purpose of your strength is not to bless yourself, but to bless somebody else. That's what happens when you're humble. Now, finally, we need to understand the efficiency of generosity, because one of the things that this Bible verse is talking about is just this. It says, one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. How is that possible? How is it possible that when somebody goes out and says, I'm going to bless the things around me, that they actually grow richer? Well, it should be obvious. The thing is, if you have a family, are you going to be richer if you have a stronger family or a weaker family? If you have a community, are you going to be richer if you have a strong community or a weak community? If you have a nation, are you going to be better off if you have a stronger nation? Or, you know what I'm saying? Like everything around you, it's part of who you are. But the other thing that's important to understand is that there is an efficiency of generosity and an inefficiency of greed and corruption. So I was listening to an interesting podcast this week, and it was a guy who works in the arms procurement industry in Australia, and he was talking about why is it that the Russian army has done so poorly, and he was talking about greed and corruption. And he pointed out that a lot of studies have suggested that the Russian military has loses about 20% to corruption. And he said the important thing to understand is they don't lose 20% of their capabilities because they have 20% corruption. They lose far more than that. He said, let me give you an example. One of the things that they've had problems with is that they have a whole bunch of tanks in storage, and what will happen is commanders or other people will go out into their tanks in storage, and they'll rip out all the copper wiring in it and go sell it for a few $100. That's a few $100s of corruption. And it means a $4 million tank no longer operates. See, that's the inefficiency of corruption. Is that really what happens is greed and corruption, what they mean is that the amount that you extract through greed and corruption is small by comparison to the amount of damage that it does. Now, the thing is that if we think that this lesson is primarily about the Russian military, then we don't understand what's going on. The reality of the situation is all of us face this all the time in our lives. Are we going to be generous with those around us? Are we going to be generous with the institutions that require us? Or are we going to be miserly? Are we going to be greedy? Are we going to be corrupt with that? Because the thing is that just a little bit of greed and corruption does massive damage to all those around us. Way more than what we saved. And that's why this passage is so interesting. It says, another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Why? Because the amount of damage that he does in the world around him is far greater than the amount that he saved. There's a demoralizing effect that happens as well, where people say, well, why should I give? That person's not giving. You know, when you're in the Russian military and some general, you can see they're stealing the thing blind. You say, well, why shouldn't I? But generosity, when it's done well, is incredibly efficient. Because what generosity does is it finds the small missing piece that unlocks greater potential. Right? A lot of times what generosity requires is you can get a person up off the ground, on their feet, functioning in society by a very small amount of input. This is true all the time. Here's the thing, it's the whole point behind teaching, right? If you're a teacher, what happens? Like you go in, you have a class full of kids and their heads are full of mush, right? Because they're kids. And what happens is you put some time into that, and then that time is magnified. If all there was a 1-to-1 ratio, well, then that wouldn't work at all. But the thing is that there's a multiplying effect that goes through. And what happens is there's also a moralizing effect that when we see other people be generous, we have a tendency to want to be generous as well. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, it says starting in verse 6, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit. So what happens is they see the apostles and they see them having joy, and what they do is they then want to have joy as well. So that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in those places, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere. So what happens is that they see that faith of one person, and they take on that faith, and then it multiplies. The other thing that's really vital to understand about the efficiency of generosity is this, that generosity gives you a future, but selfishness gives you a past. Generosity gives you a future, but selfishness gives you a past. One of the things that's interesting is I told you I had watched a couple weeks ago a video of van life. This woman was going out and she was talking about the freedom of being able to live in her van on her own, to get up whenever she wanted to give up, to go wherever she wanted to go, to stay there as long as she wanted to stay there. And she had all kinds of cool videos and pictures of her life in the van. And what her life had done is it had given her these memories. I went to this place. I saw the swallows fly, and where do they fly? Swahili land. Wherever swallows go. And then, I saw the icebergs and wherever, I don't know. She saw stuff, okay, wherever the stuff was. She had pictures to prove it. Now, here's the thing. She can look back at all those memories. But somebody else, maybe, they were working at a company, and they were going there every single day. And they were putting in their time, and they were being generous with it. And the thing is, the reason she could buy a van is because there's people who are committed to making one. And the reason that she could go this place is because somebody paved the roads. And the reason, and all through that. But the thing that's interesting is those people also were developing friendships, and they were having families, and they were doing all these different things. And now the thing is that when they get old, there's a retirement, and there's a community of people who can take care of them, who are willing to take care of them because they've invested in that community. That community will invest in them. And so what they've been developing is they've been developing a future while she's been developing a past. But that's what happens. And this principle is all through reality. Let's say you have a harvest. You can either eat the entire harvest and you can have great memories of all the great meals that you had, or you can save some of it out and you can plant that. You can cast it. And then when you cast it, that will grow. And then there will be a return on that. Maybe 100-fold. But see, that's the way that God has made reality, and that's why a spirit of generosity is so important. When you understand that God has made the system to work this way, that He's made the system to work as a reflection of Him and His glory, then we can be generous and we can be joyful in our generosity. So how do we apply this? Number one, there's the idea of believing in God. Because belief is important to who we are, we need to meditate on God's rich blessings toward us. This idea of belief and believing that God is a generous God, that He has made a world of generosity, that He's been personally generous to us is so important for our meditation this week. Secondly, belonging to Him through the covenant. What does it mean to have an inheritance in Christ? What does it mean that God has given us an inheritance in Him? And lastly, becoming glorious by being transformed to His goal of glory. What can we be generous with this week? Once again, we have all kinds of resources for you all this week. We have videos on our Facebook page. We have a daily devotional on our website. You can find those where you find our sermons posted on Facebook and on YouTube. We invite you to find your spirit of generosity this week.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Hey, have a great week.